This is an agreed upon doctrine. Very clearly, this manifests the will of the Pope himself, the will of the entire council, the will of the entire episcopate, the will of the curia, and of the best theologians of the age, is that everyone, when they read this document, when they saw this document brought forward, everyone was basically like, yeah. Into the Acta of the Second Plenary Council of Baltimore, you can literally pick it up and read it. It's in first title in the decrees, chapter 1. You can read it. You can read all of the letters from Blessed Pius IX, all of the letters from the Sacred Congregation, the Propaganda Fide. You can read all of those different letters yourself. Now, you have to learn Latin in order to read them, but if you know Latin, you can easily read these. It's not that hard. The Latin is very simple. It's very easy. So if you want to read this yourself, just to know that I'm not making any of this up, check the Acta of the Council. You can find it on archive. It's not that hard to find. So when you look at the Feeneyite argument, for those who don't know what a Feeneyite is, or Feeneyism, or anything like that, they have two central claims. And these two central claims are often misunderstood by a lot of the people who claim to refute the Feeneyites. They don't really understand actually what the Feeneyite claims are. Even some proponents of Feeneyism don't really understand what the Feeneyite claim is. There is two claims, okay? One, there is a necessity for sacramental baptism to be actually applied in order for somebody to be a member of the church. Well, in order for somebody to be saved, sorry. That other one, I'll clarify that in a second. So in order to be saved, you need to have actual sacramental baptism, okay? And related to the second one, you have to be a member of the church in order to be saved, okay? Because in Roman Catholic theology, and this is something that we agree upon, at least everyone should agree upon, in order to be a member of the Catholic Church, so in order to be joined in reality to the Catholic Church, one needs sacramental baptism. And one cannot be separated from the church by a culpable act of heresy, schism, or apostasy. Okay, this is pretty simple, pretty basic. If you don't know this, you should know this, because this is very important. And this is why a lot of people don't understand actually what the Feeneyite position is. Because what they're going to say is that when we say extra ecclesiam nulla salus, so outside of the church, there is no salvation, what we actually mean is we mean that outside of membership in the church, there is no salvation. So by sacramental baptism, one becomes a member of the church. And in order to be a member of the church, in order to be saved, you have to be a member of the church. So we can give a few examples of other individuals. So you can have people who are catechumens, for example. Catechumens, traditionally, we say that they are baptized by a baptism of desire. Catechumens are not members of the church. And catechumens are not joined as members of the church before their death, okay? So if you're a catechumen, you're unbaptized, but you want to join the church, you have a desire to enter in the church, and therefore you are joined by an act of the will, but you're not actually a member of the church. And this is a very important distinction, because really what this shows is this actually shows that the Vatican II teaching on membership, the necessity of membership of the church for salvation, that this is actually something which we find all throughout the entire tradition. So when you have, for example, somebody like St. Thomas saying that you have baptism of blood and baptism of desire that actually allows for somebody to be justified outside of membership in the church, this actually means that St. Thomas doesn't interpret the necessity of being joined to the church for salvation as a joining of membership. This is very, very vital, because when you read the various different dogmatic declarations of the church and the ways in which they describe the necessity of the church, they'll use terms like the Council of Florence, unless a man has joined himself to the church. To join yourself to the church does not mean necessarily to be entered into the church as a member through sacramental baptism. That is reading into it. And if you actually look at what the theologians believed who are at the council about baptism of desire, baptism of blood, we see that they didn't hold this at all. So these are various different assumptions which are made. So a lot of people, they kind of want to distinguish very strong, separate, I guess would be the best word. They want to separate this teaching on the one hand about baptism of desire, and on the other hand about the necessity of the church for salvation. But actually, these two go hand in hand. You cannot separate these two teachings for the Feeneites. For the Feeneites, in order to be saved, one is required to become a member of the church through sacramental baptism. Okay, so these two teachings stand together, and these two teachings fall together. If you admit that there is such a teaching as baptism of desire, baptism of blood, then you have to admit that there is a possibility of salvation for those who are not members of the church and who are rather joined through other ways, namely, we would say traditionally in voto, that is, in desire. So we bring forward a number of different arguments against the Feeneites. This is going to be one in a long list of different arguments. If you look at former videos that I did, if you look at former articles that I wrote on my website, I go over a lot of these. I've covered a lot of them in detail. But basically, this is kind of the fourth in a line of different arguments that I usually will bring forward. So the first one is that the overwhelming majority of the consensus of theologians have held to this position. So when it comes to the traditional formulation of the consensus of theologians, when you have the theologians who are agreeing amongst themselves on a certain matter, there's different degrees or levels of this, but basically, if they agree at a level of certainty, then the doctrine is certain and binding. If they agree that this is a matter of faith, then it is something which is infallibly taught. But basically, the idea is that the consensus of theologians is authoritative and binding, and we have to hold to it. So we would say that when it comes to the issues of baptism of blood, baptism of desire, that there is a consensus of the theologians on this point that is higher than mere opinion. They argue from this from the deposit of faith. They argue for this from theological reasoning, okay? So this is something that they hold at least to be certain, and therefore it's something which is binding. So that's the first argument that we're going to bring forward. The second argument that we bring forward is something similar, and it's about the nature of the episcopate. When it comes to the episcopate, that is, when it comes to the entirety of the bishops of the world, they clearly hand down and teach the ideas in their catechisms and in their various different theological works and sermons, etc., etc. They very clearly teach this theological doctrine of baptism of blood, baptism of desire. And this is manifested actually in a very interesting situation right after the Second Plenary Council of Baltimore. This is at the First Vatican Council. So for those who don't know, the First Vatican Council, it was convened, and then it was unfortunately cut short because of various different political machinations during this time, the invasion and capture of Rome. So they had to cut it short. But before they cut it short, there was actually a document De Ecclesia which was written. Originally, it was one document, and then it was split into two documents. The first one covered the role of the papacy, and the document on the role of the papacy ended up being dogmatically defined. Therefore, we know that Pastor Eternus, the teaching on papal infallibility was actually promulgated at Vatican I. But there was a second document that was written, presented to the Council Fathers, and the Council Fathers actually agreed upon the doctrine of this document. I go over in another article, but this other document, De Ecclesia, it actually goes over the issues of the necessity of the church for salvation. And it explains the necessity of the church for salvation in the exact same way that we now, to this day, explain the necessity of the church for salvation. And as theologians had described the necessity of the church for salvation for centuries at that point. It was basic teaching agreed upon throughout the episcopate. The Curia didn't disagree with it. Blessed Pius IX himself didn't disagree upon it. This was an agreed upon doctrine. Very clearly, this manifests the will of the Pope himself, the will of the entire council, the will of the entire episcopate, the will of the Curia, and of the best theologians of the age. Is that everyone, when they read this document, when they saw this document brought forward, everyone was basically like, yeah, I don't have a problem with what is being said here. And actually, any of the critiques that were had were actually in terms of weakening this doctrine and pulling it away from a very strict necessity of the church, which not a fan of. Okay, and I explain all of this in a, I think in my, I can't remember what the title of the video is, but it's like last week. So if you look for it, you should be able to find it. So we have Vatican I. Nobody's opposed to this in principle. And then we have a third case, and this is the case of after the arising of Feeney and the Feeneyite doctrine. We have the Holy Office replies under Venerable Pius XII in the 1950s. Okay, so the Holy Office replies, explains the traditional doctrine, and nobody has a problem with this either. So now that we've went over the sort of history of all of these different arguments that get brought forward, we can also go over the Council of Trent, for example. But there's now a fourth argument. And the fourth argument actually involves the direct participation of Blessed Pius IX, the direct participation of the Propaganda Fide under Blessed Pius IX. So the Curia discussed this matter. The Curia presented this before Blessed Pius IX, and he agreed to this teaching. He agreed and gave his explicit approval to this teaching to be sent to the Second Plenary Council of Baltimore. And again, nobody at this time has a problem with this. So if there weren't any Feeneyites in the year 1967, 1968, where were they? That's my question, is where were, if this is the traditional teaching of the church, where are these people for centuries? You don't find them. So to kind of give the background history, there were 3 plenary councils in Baltimore. Plenary basically means it was the entire nation coming together and giving a binding magisterial teachings, because it's not only the Pope and not only the Curia that is able to give binding teachings, but also councils of bishops, local councils of bishops, national councils of bishops are able to give binding teachings and legislation. So there were 3 plenary councils of Baltimore, 1852, 1866, 1884. You probably heard of the Baltimore Catechism, the Little Office of Baltimore, the Manual of Prayers of Baltimore. These things came from, I believe, the 3rd plenary council, although somebody might be able to correct me on this. But and also Catholic University of America came from the 3rd, although it was recommended the 2nd plenary council of Baltimore. But these various different councils of Baltimore, they did a lot of legislation. They gave various different doctrinal judgments as well. The first one was more concerned with the Immaculate Conception and the papacy. The second one with divine revelation and a lot of what would be covered at Vatican I under divine revelation and modern errors. And then the third one was kind of concerned with legislation. But there were a lot of different doctrinal points that were taught in a binding way that was inspired at the impetus of Rome. So Rome told them to discuss these various different things. It was in the oversight by an apostolic delegate from Rome. The acts and decrees were sent to Rome. They were looked over by Rome, and they were approved by Rome. So we have Rome. This isn't something merely, this is a council that, on its own authority was giving these various different declarations. That's not how it was at all. Rather, Rome was involved in every single aspect of this discussion. From beginning to end, Rome oversaw the whole process and then approved the teaching. And actually had an audience with Blessed Pius IX where specific changes encoding this teaching on the necessity of the church for salvation, encoding this teaching on the possibility of baptism of desire, was recommended explicitly by Rome to be included so as to clarify the teaching on this matter. So explicitly, Rome went and said, hey, you're talking about the necessity of the church for salvation? Well, you forgot to make these comments on invincible ignorance. So here are some comments you can add on to it. They didn't have it before. Rome told them to add this. They said, you mentioned the necessity of baptism for salvation. Well, somebody might misunderstand this. So to clarify, add whether in reality or in desire. These were things which were told to be added at the behest of Rome with the approval of Blessed Pius IX. So if these were heresies, Who was Orthodox during this time? Was there nobody Orthodox in Rome? Was Blessed Pius IX himself not Orthodox? None of the cardinals in the Curia were Orthodox. None of the bishops in America were Orthodox. None of the theologians giving oversight of this were Orthodox. Is this really what you're telling me? It's really such an absurd narrative that you have to have as a Feeneyite to deny baptism of desire, to have this strange, weird view of the necessity of membership in the church, and to deny the perpetual tradition on this point. It's such a weird view that you have to have. So you have these three. The second one was under Archbishop Spalding. Archbishop Spalding was originally from Tennessee. Archbishop Spalding, he actually has a very interesting set of lectures against Protestantism. Archbishop Spalding was pretty incredible. But this was called by Archbishop Spalding. He was the apostolic delegate. A letter was sent in January of 1866, and in January of 1866, Rome sent various different instructions for what they're supposed to talk about at this council. And then Archbishop Spalding decided that, along with as to the impetus from these instructions, in line with these instructions, that what he would do is he would provide a nice doctrinal presentation in the beginning of the decreta, so the decrees of the council. In the beginning of the decrees of the council, he would provide a doctrinal exposition of the Catholic faith. So this was something at the highest level. You know, it was a dogmatic exposition approved by all the bishops, sent to Rome, approved by Rome, with various different explicit additions on these points, and at the approval of Blessed Pius IX.